checked in at registration, you'll want to do that. The table is just outside the door. If you register, you can get a bag. You don't necessarily have to register, but you'll miss out on the bag and all the goodies inside. If you are needing any assistance about where the speaking sessions and everything are, we are going to be hanging up some signs in front of the rooms. But if you need anything at all, come and see us at registration. Our volunteers will also be having the little lanyard that says staff, so you can come by and catch one of us if you need assistance. Also, if you have purchased a t-shirt, you will want to go back to registration to pick up that t-shirt. If you would like to pick up a t-shirt or purchase a t-shirt, you can also go to the registration table and there's a page where you can purchase a t-shirt. You can pick those up today or tomorrow, but you do have to pick them up in person during the event. Also, we encourage you to share your experience on social media. So throughout the day, today and tomorrow, if you are going to be posting anything, we encourage you to use the hashtag CSGC 2019 or tag us, tag us at CSGCONF. Now, lastly, we want to thank our sponsors, one of which is NoSenseForther.com, and they have some stickers. You will find those stickers inside your bags. They've also been putting stickers out around GameStops around the community. So if any of your stickers have a silver sticker on the back, you can go to the registration table again for some art prints that No Defense Enforcer has donated as prizes. So you might want to check that out sometime today and tomorrow. We also want to thank ConocoPhillips as our sponsor, the University of Tulsa's Handy Computer Science Department, the University of Tulsa for sponsoring and hosting this event, obviously, our student volunteers who are part of the University of Tulsa's ACM chapter. And lastly but not least, of course, CymSTAR, which is a flight simulation and military training system organization. And speaking of CymSTAR, we are happy to present to you today our keynote speaker, Dan Marticello, who is the president and CEO of CymSTAR. So let's hear a round of applause.
CymSTAR is based here in Broken Arrow. We do mostly military training systems, although we do some training systems for the commercial world as well. Our focus has, in the past, been primarily the U.S. Air Force, so flight simulators, maintenance training simulators for U.S. Air Force aircraft. We've recently started expanding out further into the other services as well. Recently, we picked up a contract to upgrade all of the Marine Corps' AV-8B Harrier simulators. So we're refreshing the technology, making them more, have higher fidelity, those kinds of things to make them more realistic and provide better training to our aircrew out there that are across the world. So I'm honored to be here. As you know, CymSTAR is one of the sponsors. We're here local. I recently retired from the Air Force in July, and I moved here to Tulsa in September to take this role. And so it's my first foray to Tulsa University as a speaker, and I look forward to engaging all of you both in the computer science department and in the electrical engineering department. We rely on Tulsa University heavily for our workforce. I'd say a majority of our engineers come out of Tulsa University, and we do some cool stuff, and I'll get into a little bit of that in the course of my presentation today. One of the big things that, if you look through the history of computing, you look through the history of just mankind, even before computers, the ability to visualize or imagine a future state is what drives technology and what drives progress, right? So all the way back to the invention of fire, right? Someone had an idea, well, maybe I can harness that fire that perhaps lightning started and I can cook with it or I can heat with it. And they probably visualized doing something before they did it. If any of you play sports, you know that's a big concept these days, that you visualize success, you visualize winning, you visualize doing the actions you need to do to be a good player on a team, and then you make it happen. And so when you look at technology and you look at the computer space, you see that in the simulation space, you see that as well. Just a real quick example here, you had in 1902, a really cheesy movie about going to the moon, right? If any of you pulled it up or Googled it, it is pretty cheesy. But you can see a lot of things in there that actually came to fruition, that the imagination of putting a bullet into the moon, so to speak, and having people inside it, actually came to fruition in the 1960s and the 70s. And then you look at visualizing some of the things that everybody thought was just ludicrous, right? That you could land a rocket booster on its tail. Everybody saw the old cheesy 60 television shows where rockets landed on their tail, and now look what SpaceX has done, right? And under no small measure, they've used modeling and simulation to do that and to test those concepts. And so we'll get into that next. So as I said, I did about 26 years in the Air Force. I was an electrical engineering student at the Air Force Academy. Went in at 17 and came out at 48, right? But during that time frame, I had a lot of good experiences. I first started my career in flight testing. So I spent a number of years on Edwards Air Force Base testing some really cool things on F-15s, F-16s, F-117s, mostly in the fighter side of the house. Then, in order to get promoted, as they always joke in the Air Force, you have to take that desk job, right? And so I moved into the acquisition system, if you will, procurement, engineering, more of buying, purchasing, developing systems versus testing them. I got to say, testing was a lot more fun, but in the big scheme of things, and from a strategic perspective, the actual acquisition and deployment and sustainment of those systems is far more important over the long run. So what I'm going to focus on today is really 4 ways the Air Force, and I think any organization out there, utilizes or can use simulation, can use gaming technologies for their benefit, right? And so the 4 areas, as you can see on the screen, and I'll touch on each one of them and have a little bit of examples for each. Training, so important. Obviously, we just talked about that during the introduction. If you can train in the virtual world, you can visualize, it'll greatly increase your performance or your likelihood of success in the real world. Testing, obviously if you have a system that's very complex, that's potentially putting you or others at risk because it operates in the air or in the ocean or at high speeds, things that can hurt you, you probably want to test that out in the virtual world before you put your body at risk. And then analysis of alternatives. How do you decide what is the best choice going forward? Whether that's a weapon system, whether that's where do you want to live, all those kinds of things, you can do some modeling and some simulation to help inform your decisions. And then finally, with the amount of data that's flowing through our systems today, whether it's a company like CymSTAR, where we have all of our accounting and finance data, our project progress data, how do you take all that data and package it in a manner that you can then convey that to your leadership or to yourself to understand what's really going on? And so that's another area that I think modeling and simulation pays off, is in that visualization of complex data. So training, probably the most utilized space for simulations other than potentially gaming. And it is really sort of a gaming environment too for training, right? But the key aspects that make a training system different from a gaming system is training needs to have high fidelity. It has to have a fidelity sufficient enough to allow the user to think that they're actually operating or feel like they're operating a real machine, right? So if it's cheesy, if it's not matrixy, if it doesn't have a high enough fidelity, it will be discounted by the user and will not provide as effective training as necessary. And obviously, as computing power has grown and as displays have gotten better, and now with virtual reality goggles and those kinds of things, fidelity is greatly increased. And so the ability to do things in a training system are much more available today than they were in the past. And one key example of that is virtual aerial refueling, is what the Air Force does now. So when you think about training an air crew to put 2 airplanes going about 400 knots in close proximity to each other and passing gasoline from jet fuel from one to the other, that's a pretty challenging thing to learn, especially in the real world with turbulence and weather, night, all those kinds of things. And so in the past, in order to train that skill and keep that skill fresh, the Air Force had to spend a tremendous amount of money just doing it for practice. And so what simulators have allowed us to do now is do a lot of that practice in the virtual world. And just an example, a C-17 cargo aircraft costs the U.S. government $22,000 to $26,000 per hour to operate. When you figure in the fuel, all the maintenance, all of the mechanical sustainment of that system, $22,000 an hour. When you look at the C-17 simulator that we can now do a lot of that training on, it's $300 an hour. So just a huge order of magnitude less expensive. And frankly, you can do things you wouldn't want to try and do in the real world. You can put the worst day of weather, lightning storms, you name it. You can make it a really bad day in the simulator and get some really good training that you would never want to risk the real assets in the real world. Concurrency is also incredibly important, and this is something that the Air Force has struggled with, and I think any organization struggles with because it requires dollars, right? It requires not just the upfront dollars, it requires recurring dollars. And what concurrency means is what you see is what you get. You have to keep the simulator matching the actual system. And so inevitably there's always money to upgrade the real system, and you're always trying to scrape enough money to upgrade the video game, right? But it's so important to do that. Otherwise you don't have effective learning, right? If a switch is in space A in the aircraft and it's in space B in the simulator, it's probably not going to be good training, because when air crew member or the pilot has to make an instinctual decision and he's practiced a lot in the training system, it better be in the right space in the real world, right? So that's incredibly important as you develop simulations to model real world systems, that you always keep concurrency in mind, and that you plan for upgrades to match the upgrades in the real system. And then, of course, affordability, it sort of comes on its own a little bit with the great disparity between systems in the real world versus simulators. But it still is an important consideration. And so you have to keep in mind what level of fidelity do you need to train. If you're doing a maintenance simulator or a part task trainer, you may not need all the bells and whistles you can do on a full flight simulator. So balance those things, your requirements versus what you're going to spend to meet those requirements. And then, as I said, train like you fight, fight like you train. The way the Air Force is going now on training is, before, training systems used to be discrete entities, right? You as a C-17 pilot or as an F-15 maintainer would use your training system to train your specific tasks. What's happened over the last decade or so is we've started to move more into distributed mission operations, which is, like those role-playing games out there where you have hundreds, if not thousands, of people playing all at the same time. And so we're linking training systems now. The Air Force is linking training systems, and we at CymSTAR are doing some stuff to help them so that they can play those multiplayer games. They can have all of the force package all working together. So, for instance, you would have F-15s up in North Dakota, potentially linked to F-16s down in South Carolina, linked to C-17s at Scott Air Force Base or some other location, all carrying out a virtual exercise or a virtual war, if you will, so that they can practice working together all the way down to the radio frequency, the radio calls, all of that kind of thing, modeled and simulated in a multiplayer game like that. The next step beyond that, which has just been a demonstration just recently finished up out at Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada, is the concept of live virtual constructive. Constructive are entities that are purely computer generated, right? Like in a video game, it would be the bad guys that really don't have anybody behind them. They're just generated and rendered by the computer. Virtual are the players that are playing in the virtual space, right? The folks that are in simulators, doing what they would do in the real world, but they're doing it in the virtual world. And then you take the live portion and you link that together. And if you do it right, the live folks should not know whether the entity they're seeing on their radar or on their sensor system is actually out there 100, 200, 300 miles away, or if that's real, or if that's a virtual entity or a constructive entity. And it allows all of those systems to play together. Now, why would you may ask, why would you want to link live? Live is expensive. Why would you want to do that? Well, because some areas you can't model very well in a train system, and some of those are the high-performance fighters. It's one thing to sit in a simulator and do all those kinds of things, all the activities you need to do. It's quite another when you're up at 30,000, 40,000 feet and you're you're pulling sustained G's on your body and surviving in that environment, right? And so you want to bring all of that together. So the first time they're under stress, and their crew members under stress in that physical environment, it's not in the real fight. So that's training. Now we move on to testing. This was near and dear to my heart, being a former flight test guy. But the key tenet, and this is the big difference I think that flight testing underwent over the last 20, 30 years versus the way it used to be. I remember in test pilot school we had Chuck Yeager come and speak to us, who, as you know, was the first person to break the sound barrier. And he said that we were not pushing the envelope hard enough because we weren't killing a pilot at once a month, right? Something of that nature. And he was obviously kind of tongue-in-cheek about it, but his point was we're not pushing the envelope. And what I think he missed is we are, but we tend to be a little more careful now. We tend to be able to model things in the virtual world first. So we can find the things that would have in the past probably killed a pilot, and we can find those in the training system, in the virtual world, and avoid that fatality, right? So the way we've moved towards it now, in the old days it used to be fly, fix, fly, is what we called it. So they would fly the airplane and they would scare themselves because they would find a problem. They would come back down, they would write a report about this is really bad, it needs to be fixed. Then the engineers would make a tweak to the aircraft, and then they would send it back up again and see if it fixed. Kind of dangerous, right? And very time consuming. Fly, fix, fly, fix, fly, fix. Okay, we think we got it just about right. What we've moved to now is predict, fly, and validate. So what you do is you build that model in the virtual world. You make predictions based on science, based on aeronautical engineering, electrical engineering, what your system's going to do. You practice it in the simulator, and then you conservatively pick some points out there when you get in the real airplane to validate that your model is true. If your model says at this throttle setting, at this altitude, you should be going this speed and have this angle of attack, and you see that, then that gives you confidence that your model is correct. If you see something different, then you know maybe your model needs some work, right? And you come back down and you tweak that until you feel that you have a model that can sufficiently and accurately predict what you're going to see. And that way, using that kind of methodology, you can go up to those very high-risk points. How fast can what's the fastest the airplane can go? What's the highest the airplane can go? You can approach those much more conservatively and with a much more safer methodology. Simulation can save lives. F-22 was an example of when predict, fly, validate didn't occur. And largely it was because the asset wasn't concurrent, the training system wasn't concurrent, and it wasn't readily available. And so I had a good friend who was a test pilot go out and do a maneuver in an F-22 during a flight test that took his life. When the safety boards and all those convened to figure out what went wrong, and they used the simulator, they saw that the position that aircraft was put in was not recoverable. Now, in hindsight, it would have been good to have flown that maneuver before in the virtual world, before the real world, right? And so that was another indication that predict, fly, validate is the way to go versus fly, fix, fly. 737 MAX, I mean, the jury's still out as to what exactly was going on with those aircraft and their elevator there on the tail. However, you better believe that Boeing is probably running a lot of simulations now with their software fix over and over and over, and looking at what happens when a component fails, what happens when a component is getting bad data. Sadly, it's often in this world, there's always enough time to do it right the second time, right? But ideally, you can use that first time in the training system and then do the second time when it's good to go. On the horizon, so looking at testing, what's going on right now, I think a lot of work is being done in artificial intelligence, whether that's drones that are collecting intelligence, or it's systems that provide decision support to humans. There's a lot of testing going on right now to see if AI can give you a competitive advantage, not only in the military space, but across, I think, all sectors of industry. Hypersonics is kind of the neatest thing if you're an aero engineer or somebody that's interested in that kind of thing. That seems to be the latest thing, just the Mach 5 plus type of stuff. Obviously, a lot of modeling and simulation going into that, and testing to make sure that we can put something up at that speed and altitude that it's going to operate the way we think it is. And then obviously space operations is important too. It's very difficult to test how things are going to operate in space simply because of the cost. You can't just put things up there and experiment. You want to do a lot more in the virtual world, troubleshooting, all those kind of things before you launch a probe and say you're going to Mars. You want to make sure you sort of run down all those cases using simulation and testing. The third area, analysis of alternatives, is much more of a decision kind of thing. How can you use models in simulation, in games, to inform resource allocation, right, primarily? How do you, if you buy A versus B, will it give you an advantage? Will it give you a disadvantage? All those kind of things you can do a lot more case studies. You can use statistical analysis, Monte Carlo runs, if you will. You can do a lot of things in the virtual world that you can't do effectively in the real world. One of those things is, as I said, Monte Carlo, using statistics to do thousands of runs, if you will, thousands of possibilities of how things play out and see over time what it looks like versus having to make a decision on one or two cases that you could potentially spend money for in the real world. Where that translated in the Air Force was getting the biggest bang for the buck, right? And so as the Air Force was looking to invest in stealth technologies like the F-117 initially, and then the B-2, and now the future B-21, you better believe that there was a lot of modeling of what an air campaign would look like with assets that have those kinds of technologies available. Is one F-117 better than 5 F-16s to take out an enemy radar site? Those kinds of models, those kinds of statistical analyses were done in order to make sure that we made the right resource allocations to pick the right force mix going forward. Fourth generation versus fifth generation is one that's in the news now. You've seen that the Air Force has recently decided to buy more F-15s, which is a fourth generation aircraft, to augment their fifth generation F-35 and F-22 fleet. You better believe that there was some modeling going on to understand what that mix looked like and whether it was worth the investment in the fourth generation additional fighters to augment those fifth gens, or if it would have made more sense to buy more fifth gens. So those kinds of questions are easily modeled and worked in the virtual world versus in the real world. Other applications, real options is a big one. When I was at MIT as a grad student, we had a professor there that really talked up how this can be used. For instance, he looked at the easy example at the beginning of the course was if you were going to build a parking garage in downtown Boston, how would you decide how many levels to put in that garage? What his point was is you could use modeling and simulation and give yourself the ability to make decisions later in the program, right? So you might build only a 3-level garage at the start of the project, but you built the underlying structure and pylons to be able to hold up to maybe 8 floors. And so then you can use Monte Carlo analysis, and you can see how the real world plays out, and every year decide whether you want to add a floor or not. What that does is it allows you to maximize your upside if things are going your way, but it also allows you to minimize your downside if things don't go your way, right? So if the economy tanked and we didn't need a 4 or 5 level garage in Boston, you could stand pat at the 3 and minimize your losses and minimize your investment. So those kinds of scenarios lend themselves to modeling and simulation. Great. Obviously, climate modeling very complex systems. How do you analyze what's going on and predict what's going on, and then financial scenarios as well. Lastly, visualization of complex data. Making the complex understandable can be very difficult these days. Everybody's sort of deluged with data, right? And so even just as small a task as going to Walmart or something to buy a pair of flip-flops. In the old days, there might have been 2 sets of flip-flops. Now there's 25 different kinds, right? How do you process all of these choices that are constantly confronting you, both in your personal life and in your professional life? And so sometimes taking all that data and being able to package it correctly, be able to visualize it, will make the choice more obvious, right? And so you have to be careful with that. You don't want the visualization to skew your decision, but you also want it to be able to maybe boil it down to what's important. What does that data really show, right? If you look at a ream of paper with numbers on it, that really allow you to see trends, right? But if you're able to graph it or visualize it or show how it changes over time, you may be able to detect trends. You may be able to detect networks and linkages between things that you hadn't even seen. And then you may be able to identify risks and opportunities to your model. I've left a link in there. I'm sure this briefing will be available. I would encourage you to look at that, as well as there's some other sites that have visualizations as well. It'll really open your mind and go, wow, this is kind of cool how they took just boring data and made it into something that was visually interesting, visually compelling, and also ideally provided an ability to understand the underlying data. So in conclusion, what first occurs in the virtual informs and shapes our future reality. That's been happening since the dawn of time. And now with the tools we have today in the gaming and simulation world, we can do it better, faster, and cheaper. Imagine and dream big. It's things like SpaceX landing a rocket on its tail. I mean, folks thought that was crazy, and now it's commonplace, right? So invent that future and make it what you want it to be. Well, while you do that, though, be responsible and cognizant of downstream effects. I know there's a lot of talk about artificial intelligence. Some folks are a little worried about that, right? We don't want a future that looks like the Terminator. So, keep those things in mind. Use your models to go beyond just what you think it's going to look like, but what are the unintended consequences too? Think about those as you design your systems and design the way forward in the future. And then consider service before self, not necessarily only in a military framework, but also in where you choose to work. Are you doing things that forward humanity, that help protect or serve? Consider that for a while. It is very rewarding. I'll tell you that from experience. And then lastly, and there's a typo which I'll fix after, but the Eagle and Fledgling statue always struck me as something that was very important when I was there at the Air Force Academy, and it's really been a guiding light for me across my entire career. And that's man's flight through life is sustained, is the word that should be there, by the power of his knowledge. And what that means is all of us, men, women alike, we can do better on our lives if we have knowledge. Knowledge is power. You've all heard that many times. Simulation provides you that knowledge in a way that's less expensive, potentially higher fidelity, and allows you to make more informed decisions. And so, I'm thankful for being invited here today. I'll open it up for questions now. If anybody has any questions or comments, I'll be happy to take them. Yes, sir.
So you mentioned that CymSTAR hires a lot of people from University of Tulsa. What are the skills you guys are looking for?
So predominantly in the past, we've focused primarily on software engineers. So we want software engineers that understand physics, right? Because obviously, if you're building a system that's modeling a real-world system, you want to have some understanding of how the real world works, and largely that's physics. And so folks that have that kind of background, they're software engineers with an understanding of underlying science and technology are who we traditionally sought. Aeronautical engineers as well, mechanical engineers, electrical engineers, do a lot of the support functions as well, whether it's building the aero model that the software engineers can then put into the virtual world, electrical and mechanical to actually build the chassis and the systems, and the power and everything that makes the virtual system operate. And then lastly, we're looking to expand potentially more into the computer science area, not just the hardcore software engineers. There's a lot of tasks as systems grow more complex and networked where we feel computer scientists are probably a good match as well. So those are the areas that we traditionally have hired, and we expect as we grow over the next few years that we'll continue that hiring. Yes, sir.
You mentioned bowling dishwashing. With your familiarity with the aeronautic industry, would you be surprised at how early bowling knowledge of the words that they use will happen? I mean, I haven't even totally confirmed this is, but yeah, their chairman has already spoken publicly instead of bowling totally voluntary.
Well, I think that's, it is their product, right? And so I don't want to speculate as to what the root cause is until the report comes out.
That's what's the point.
But I think that regardless of what the root cause is, it's incumbent on a CEO to take responsibility for their product, right? As I would be expected to take the responsibility for any product that goes out of CymSTAR. Now that doesn't necessarily mean that Boeing's at fault, but but I think that's the right thing to do initially, is to take ownership and utilize the resources of the company to get to the cause. So I think from an ethical perspective, that's admirable, and also from a business perspective, it's a smart thing to do as well. Yes, ma'am.
Yes, I noticed that you said you're interested in the engineers for, is it design or developing your systems? What about the design also? Or are you just, I'm really new to this, so I'm asking for my son, who's a junior.
Yeah, no, it's a good question, right? Because you've seen some engineers design some clunky interfaces, right? I remember we had an F-16, one of the very early F-16 models, a Block 10 is what they were called. They had a computer on it was, number one, the human factors was terrible. It was in the back, it was way back here on by the pilot's hip. And as you know, in the F-16, you're inclined at about 30 degrees in that seat. And then this data entry portal, if you will, was back down here. And so with your parachute harness on and your helmet on and that very glass cockpit, trying to first get back there and enter data was hard in its own, right? And then the actual data entry interface, I think, was designed by the Klingons. It didn't. It was alphanumerics, and they didn't make a lot of sense, and it wasn't intuitive. And I remember being in the back seat of an F-16 on multiple occasions where the pilot nearly had a meltdown trying to get the data he needed to enter in that system in there. Right? I remember one time at Edwards, I was at the end of the runway. We were doing our pre-flight checks right before takeoff. And the pilot and I noticed that the system thought we had an 8-9 missile on the wing that we didn't have. And that's important in an F-16 that you match what you actually have, because it alters the flight control system. And so he had to delete that missile, if you will, out of the flight control system computer. He had a lot of trouble with that. It wasn't going with him, right? And finally he took both his fists and started pounding the dashboard out of frustration to then calm down, and then was able to do it. But I was not too happy about that, being in the back seat of this single-engine fighter with him pounding on the dashboard. I said, hey, you should be taking care of this. We're entrusting our lives to this in about 2 minutes, right? And so I think design is super important. If the interface is clunky, if it's not visually appealing, those kinds of ephemeral characteristics are important to acceptance of the system, right? And so you better believe later versions of the F-16 corrected that. That entry could then be now on the upfront controller, right in front of the pilot's face, and that terrible computer went away, right? And so I don't know if we necessarily have any design folks in our space now, but it's something that we're looking at, and I think that any of our engineers ought to go through at least a short course on that kind of thing too, where we're building an instructor-operator interface or something of that nature.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Yes, sir.
Who are your major customers?
So we sort of have 2 sets of major customers. Our first, obviously, the U.S. Air Force has been our primary major customer in the past. We have now since won contracts with the Army and the Navy as well, with the Marine Corps as a subset, as I spoke to earlier. And then our second set of customers is large businesses that are engaged in like activities. So we support the Boeings, CAE, another bigger simulator company, Flight Safety, which is also based in Broken Arrow, L3 down in Arlington, Texas, those larger companies that do modeling, simulation, training. We are often a supplier to them.
Working with the DoD like you guys do you require some of your employees to have a secret clearance?
Definitely. I'd say the majority of our engineers have security clearances. The majority of them do not have them when they arrive, and we work with them to put them through that process so that they can have a clearance and we put them on programs that require that. Anything else?
I did experimentation with the space lab and with Justice Lab back and forth to use spoken voice commands. Do you not work with that in simulation or in these jets at all? In using spoken voice commands to run the computers?
It's funny you bring that up. I remember as a young officer, as a captain, I participated in a study. I was in an OV-10 Bronco. If you want to Google that, it's kind of a strange-looking airplane. It did close air support in the Vietnam era, but it could pull 7 Gs in a dive, right? So if you put it in a spiral dive, you control 7G sustain. And the aircraft structure will allow that. And the study I was in was they put me in the back seat of that aircraft, and I basically spoke words that were flashed in front of me on the screen to see if the computer could understand that. And so the military did look at that a lot, but I think the end result was that it really wasn't that much value added in that space. Number one, your voice changes considerably under G-load. Number two, the majority of the information now is much more to the pilot versus from the pilot to the aircraft, right? The things that the pilot does now is more of an information manager in like an F-35 or an F-22. They're seeing what all the sensors are fusing together into an integrated air picture, and then making decisions as to where to put the airplane and where to put when to release weapons, which really doesn't require much voice. It's an interesting concept though, and I think obviously with Siri and Alexa and those kinds of things, the technology's gotten a lot better, but I don't think it's really proven to be that much value added in that environment.
You said you served in the Air Force?
I did.
How long?
26 years.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. All right, is that it? I'll stick around afterwards if anybody has any one-on-one questions they want to ask. And if you are a software engineer, electrical engineer, aeronautical engineer, mechanical engineer, computer science major, please keep CymSTAR in mind. Thank you very much.